Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy and it's Friday the 8th of April and this evening we're joined by Councillor Siobhan Tolland and Maggie Chapman, Green MSP, to discuss the funding crisis affecting the university. Good evening Siobhan, good evening Maggie, how are you both?
Good,
Good
thank
evening,
you.
Brian. Good,
Thanks.
doing well.
Thanks for giving up part of your Friday night for us, we really appreciate it. But as usual, we're going to start with today's roundup of the latest news headlines. The UK House of Commons will be recalled on Saturday to discuss nationalising British Steel after a failed deal to keep two blast furnaces open at its Scunthorpe site. The UK government aims to protect steel production. Scotland's SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn is urging a rethink on the planned closure of the Grangemouth refinery in light of these developments. China raised tariffs on US imports to 125% today, escalating its trade dispute with Washington. The move comes amid global market losses, with Japan's Nikkei down 5% and US stocks falling sharply. Oil prices also dropped for a second week as uncertainty over US tariff policy contributed to some of the most volatile trading since the early days of the pandemic. Michael Gove and Alistair Jack have been nominated for peerages in Rishi Sunak's resignation honours list. The SNP criticised the move, renewing calls to abolish the House of Lords, which they argue is undemocratic and unaccountable. The party maintains that the system allows political figures to return to power without a public vote and say it benefits both the UK Conservative and Labour parties at Scotland's expense. The US Supreme Court has upheld a judge's order requiring the US federal government to help return Cllr Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran man deported in error from Maryland. The court agreed the US must assist in his release from custody in El Salvador. Colonel Susanna Mayers has been removed as commander of the US Putifik space base in Greenland following her criticisms of Vice President J.D. Vance's remarks against Denmark during his visit last month. The University of Glasgow has appointed Professor Nina Parish as head of the School of Modern Languages and Cultures. She joins from the University of Stirling and will begin her role on the 1st of August 2025. And the Scottish Government has appointed Professor Rachel Sanderson as its new International Education Envoy. Announced by Business Minister Richard Lochhead during a visit to China, the role will support global partnerships, attract international talent and promote investment in Scottish universities. Professor Sanderson, currently at the University of Glasgow, will serve a one-year term with the option to extend. The National Yes Registry is launching its Get Counted for Independence campaign this weekend via the Indie app. The grassroots initiative aims to connect and publicly count supporters of Scottish independence across the country. So, Maggie, is there anything in today's news roundup that you'd like to highlight or point in particular?
I mean, I suppose one thing just to say on the steel crisis, that the UK government is being recalled to debate in Parliament, in the Westminster Parliament tomorrow. I think it's very telling that the same urgency and the same approach wasn't taken to the steel crisis in Wales at Tata Steel. And I do wonder why, given that what is likely to be discussed tomorrow still falls short of nationalisation, when is it that we are going to get a proper conversation in all of our governments about nationalising some of the big industrial industries, the big industrial infrastructure companies and bases that we have in the UK? One of the biggest problems that I think our governments have faced in the last 30 to 40 years is not having control over the key economic drivers, the big industrial complexes, whether that's steel, whether that's oil and gas in Scotland, whether that's Grangemouth in Scotland. You know, we've been held hostage by private corporations, by very wealthy men for far too long. And I just wish the UK Labour government would take this crisis seriously and have a proper conversation about nationalising the industries that we know our economy needs.
Thank you. Forgive me. Thank you, Maggie. Siobhan, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Just following on from Maggie, actually, it's not necessarily relate to the news article, but I think the nationalisation comes also with the renewable future that we have. The kind of green crisis is on, the eco crisis is on, and we will never resolve it at the hands of the free market. So we need to start taking control of the resources that we have, but actually also the potential resources for a kind of greener future as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. And now for today's Ukraine update, and today is the 1143rd day of the war in Ukraine. European allies have announced a surge of military support for Ukraine, with the UK government unveiling £450 million in UK-led aid. The support is partly aimed at strengthening the country's position ahead of any peace deal with Russia. The UK will provide £350 million this year, with Norway contributing further funding. Britain's Ministry of Defence said on today. The funding will provide repairs and maintenance to vehicles and equipment, as well as radar systems, anti-tank mines and hundreds of thousands of drones. The UK and Germany are hosting a meeting of 50 nations at NATO's headquarters in Brussels today. UK Defence Secretary John Healey and his German counterpart, Defence Minister Boris Pistorius, will co-chair the 27th Ukraine Defence Contact Group, a role previously performed by the US Defence Secretary until Donald Trump's return to office. On Thursday, Mr Healey pressed his counterparts from about 30 countries to forge ahead with developing plans to deploy troops to Ukraine under any future peace agreement with Russia. Prince Harry has visited amputees and wounded military personnel at an orthopaedic clinic in Ukraine. The Prince met wounded veterans at the Superhuman Centre in Lviv, which treats and rehabilitates injured military personnel and civilians, including children affected by the war. Russia is using slickly produced propaganda videos about being tough men to recruit Chinese men to fight alongside its forces in Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky said on Tuesday that 2 Chinese nationals had been captured in the eastern Donetsk region and accused Moscow of trying to involve China directly or indirectly in the conflict. Admiral Samuel Paparo, the top US commander in the Pacific, has warned senators that the military support that China and North Korea are giving Russia in its war on Ukraine is a security risk in his region, as Moscow provides critical military assistance to both in return. Admiral Paparo told the Senate Armed Services Committee that China has provided 70% of the machine tools and 90% of the legacy chips to Russia to help Moscow rebuild its war machine. On Thursday, Russia's defense ministry said forces had captured the village of Zuravka in Ukraine's northern border region of Sumy. Ukrainian officials said there was intensified Russian military activity on their side of the border, but gave no acknowledgement that Zuravka had fallen into Russian hands. The US ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink, is stepping down from her post after nearly 3 years in Kyiv, amid uncertainty over the Trump administration's attempts to broker a peace deal to end the war. Brink has been outspoken in her support for arming Ukraine and had continued her advocacy even after Donald Trump took office in January and began to pressure Ukraine to accept a ceasefire. Excuse me. Maggie, sorry, did I come to you first last time? I think I've got my... Siobhan, I'm so sorry. I think it's your turn to answer first. Is there anything that you'd like to highlight from today's Ukraine update?
I mean, really just that Donald Trump isn't brokering any peace deal. What he's actually, I think, brokering is a deal with Russia in order to annex Ukraine and bully them into accepting those deals. If we look at what they're doing in Gaza, it's a very similar strategy as well. It's about It's about land, it's about power, it's about resources. So it's to kind of frame it as a peace deal, I think, is disingenuous at best from Donald Trump, because it's not a peace deal. It's a takeover, and it's two, as Maggie mentioned earlier on, two very rich white men trying to basically split up the globe between them.
Thank you, Siobhan. Maggie, is there anything that you'd like to highlight from the Ukraine?
Yeah, I agree with Siobhan. I think what's clear here is that, as Siobhan says, there isn't a peace deal being brokered here. What's happening is the use of power, the use of immense power, both a military and political power, to seize territory. And this is something that Trump clearly has in common with Putin. Putin's actually done it. Trump says he wants to, given his comments about Greenland, about Canada, about other parts of the world. And what we need is for every other government, including the UK government, to stand up very firmly and say, this is not acceptable. This is not how global geopolitics should be unfolding. And I think, the other thing to remember in all of this is Ukrainian communities, Ukrainian citizens who are just trying to survive, trying as best they can to get by, despite the destruction of their institutions, the destruction of their transport facilities, their hospitals, their schools. They are still trying to survive. And despite the reduction in support in international aid, we cannot forget about the humanitarian need that remains in Ukraine, in vast areas of a country that has been on the receiving end of horrendous bombing campaigns. As Siobhan alluded to as well, we can see a read across to what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, the Palestinian territories too, and the way in which Trump and Putin are controlling global geopolitics at the moment means that humanitarian aid, the resources and support that is vital to human survival, basic human survival, is not getting to where it needs to go. And it needs to get to communities in Ukraine, and it needs to get to communities in Palestine. And those political gains are stopping that happening.
Thank you, Maggie. And now we've got the latest update from Gaza. At least 50,912 Palestinians have been killed and 115,981 have been injured in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023, and that's according to the Gaza Health Authority. At least 10 Palestinians have been killed, including 7 children, in an Israeli attack on Khan Yunis. A Palestinian has been killed and 4 others wounded following an aerial attack on a group of civilians in Rafah. And US fighters have carried out a series of air attacks on Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, including strikes on the capital Sana'a. Israeli raids continued across the occupied West Bank, with Israeli forces arresting the mother and brother of a wanted Palestinian man in the city of Jenin. Israel's military is organising hiking tours for civilians in newly occupied Syrian territory during the Passover holiday, local media has reported. The twice-daily tours in the occupied Golan Heights will run for a week beginning this Sunday. Under a military escort in bulletproof buses, small groups will travel up to 2.5 kilometres into Syrian territory. Israel has occupied the Golan Heights since 1967 and now controls hundreds more square kilometres of Syrian land. In an interview, Israel Emmanuel Macron has said France plans to recognise a Palestinian state within months and could make the move at a UN conference on settling the Israel-Palestinian conflict in New York in June. And so, Maggie, I think it is your turn to go first this time. Is there anything there that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need the international community to do is recognise a Palestinian state. That's very, very important. But alongside that has to be targeted action to stop the Israeli attacks on Palestine, whether that's in Gaza, whether that's in the West Bank. We know, and Scottish Greens and others have been saying for ages that Israel is an apartheid colonial oppressor state. its only interest is in the obliteration of the Palestinian people. We can see that by how it's targeted hospitals, universities, the infrastructure of Palestinian life and culture. That's what's happening here. This genocide is to destroy Palestine. We can't allow that to happen. So, in addition to recognizing Palestine as a state, and that gives then that right to statehood gives rights to those citizens, which in our view they should already have. But alongside that, we need to stop funding the military-industrial complex that is arming Israel. We know that public money in Scotland and the rest of the UK is being spent to make either the bombs themselves or components of weapons and of aircraft that are dropping bombs on Palestinians. That should shame both of our governments. We know that the UK government is maybe much more complicit in this, but we also know that public money has gone through Scottish enterprise to arms companies in Scotland. And that shouldn't be acceptable. That cannot be acceptable when there is a genocide going on. We should be stopping everything associated with that military-industrial complex. Why is it that there's always money for war? There's always money to build bombs, to build weapons of destruction, and yet when it comes to building peace, we walk away. That's just not good enough. We have to be there. We have to be there supporting Palestinians to rebuild their lives. You look at the pictures coming out of Gaza now. What were flourishing communities, flourishing local economies? They've been flattened. And we have a responsibility, not only because of Britain's role in setting up the situation 76 years ago, but also in our ongoing complicity because we are continuing to arm Israel and not sanction it in any way near as strict a sense that we should be. We have a grave responsibility to stand up for and with the Palestinian people. And this ongoing slaughter of life cannot be allowed to continue unchecked.
Thank you, Maggie. Siobhan, is there anything that you'd like to highlight?
I think one of the early moments when Trump took over that probably will haunt me till the day I die is when Netanyahu come to visit Donald Trump, and the look on his face as if all these Christmases had come at once, because Donald Trump had clearly made it quite clear to Netanyahu and to the Israel extreme right-wing state that he was going to back Israel to the hilt in terms of the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people in Gaza. We're turning so far right now that we're almost dizzy at the speed and the severity of which we're turning. And I said this before on this programme, but Gaza has, I think, become an international test case of the erosion of human rights. And as Maggie said, in terms of the kind of arms deals and arming Israel, there are times and places where we just have to draw a line. And I'm not sure that line is being drawn already, because we are literally watching live stream a genocide happening and plans now for complete ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people in Gaza, with the disgusting caveat that it will be turned into some terrible kind of tourist attraction, which is extraordinarily Trumpian in its extreme. But these are very, very testing times, and these are the moments where kind of internationally we are tested on what our action is or what our inaction is as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. Viewers will probably notice that we don't have a normal format this evening, because we're going to devote the rest of the show to Dundee University and the crisis that it finds itself facing. We're going to try and unpack the history of that crisis and find out how it unfolded. So the University of Dundee court was informed that the university was in financial crisis with around a £30 million deficit on November of 12th last year. So we're just wondering, were there concerns within the university community before then? Siobhan, I believe, so you're a counsellor, but I think it's in your ward, Dundee University, isn't it? Is there anything you can tell us?
No, sorry, it's
No?
not. I work at the university.
All right.
I work in student support. So I've worked here since I think 2016. So yes, I mean, as a kind of someone that's working, I mean, we knew that there were some issues. We knew that cuts were probably coming, but the severity and the kind of speed by which the crisis appeared was, I think, again, kind of turning us dizzy. We had no idea the level of financial crisis that we're in. It seems, and the investigation will consider whether this is the case or not, but it seems that most people within the university hierarchy didn't know this either. So it's kind of been a very, very tense time. They we'll talk about this in a little bit, but when they were called to the Scottish Parliament Education Committee, I think pretty much all our jaws were dropping in absolute shock and horror as the events unfolded, and we had a recount of those events. We can talk about that a little bit in a minute, but that day on November the 12th, I think we were all a bit in shock and not quite sure what we were going to do. The issue that we had, of course, is we kept getting told by the university executive group is, we'll get back to you, we're working on a plan, we'll get back to you. And then we waited, and then we waited, and then we kept on waiting, and then we had a string of resignations, and then we still kept on waiting, and then we'll get to the kind of plan probably in a bit later, and I'll let Maggie take over now.
Thank you. Maggie, were there any hints in Holyrood about the troubles that were appearing in Dundee?
So not really. So as a Northeast MSP, the first I heard of the severity, as Siobhan said, was in mid-November, when the financial crisis, that the black hole of £30 million was identified, and we saw the then principal Ian Gillespie resign and basically just disappear. But when there were then the trade unions, the campus unions carried on working together. They've been working well together, but they organised some town hall meetings, so all staff meetings, and I attended the one that took place before Christmas, and there were over 1,000 people, both in person and online, at that meeting. And even members of the university court who were at that meeting had said that at the September court meeting, there wasn't any indication of the severity of financial difficulties. However, what's become clear just this week, actually, through work by the Courier and through Freedom of Information requests, is that there were questions raised about the finances as early as September. So people in the senior management clearly knew that there were questions being asked. There were questions to answer, and none of that was filtering down. None of that seemed to be featuring in the strategic thinking, in the forward planning of the institution at all. So there's been a lot going on in 5 months, but I think that for me, one of the most important points, one of the most important things that hasn't happened in any meaningful way in the last 5 months is genuine engagement with the campus trade unions, with the staff body as a whole, and with the students. Because let's remember, who actually is the University of Dundee? Who makes up that university? It's the students, and it's the staff who teach them and who support them. University management are there to facilitate the learning, the teaching, the education, the research, the thinking, the creativity, the skills development, the people development that should happen. University management is there to support and facilitate and enable all of that, not to control. And we've seen very little of that support enabling, and we've seen, I would say, virtually no genuine engagement, genuine discussions with staff, because the financial recovery plan that was put forward by university management, nobody wants it. The Scottish Government doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. So there hasn't been those conversations. So, you ask, were we aware? I think no. And the more questions we've been asking, it seems we just are told the same thing. And something has to change in the culture of the institution, of the management of the institution. Something has to change, and it has to change very quickly, because staff members' jobs are on the line, students' degrees are on the line. We cannot let the institution fail in that way.
Thank you. So we're moving on to the causes of the crisis and allegations of possible fraudulent transactions. The cause of the crisis has been attributed to a decline in international student recruitment, in addition to the general issues of inflation, rising costs and difficulties with higher education funding generally. But we're wondering to what extent is that the case, and what impact did the university's financial management have on this crisis? Siobhan, yeah, can I come to you, Siobhan, as a member of staff? I'm sorry I didn't realise that the first time.
No, fine.
Is there anything that you can...
You'll be aware, and for those that maybe don't know, once the recovery plan came out, that was kind of published by the university when we were, I think, the third week on strike. So what that did was basically say there will be 632 full-time equivalent job losses. There was also additionally another 257 that we'd lost through an immediate freeze on jobs in November once the crisis became apparent. There is a staff of around 3,200, so you're talking about a third of that. A third of the workforce. So effectively what happened, the university executive group were called to the Scottish Parliament Education Committee, and it's there where we began to get a little bit more information about what's actually happening and what actually went on. So basically what they did, there's a couple of factors, I think, that they predicated quite a lot on international students, specifically actually Nigerian students, many of which, about 50% of Nigerian students bring families with them. But of course, there was a couple of factors there. The Nigerian currency collapsed somewhere along that time frame. There was also the fact, of course, that the hostile environment that the UK and the Labour Party in government kept, which meant people couldn't bring in their families as they're entering into the UK. So that caused a bit of a collapse in terms of international students. Now, the university, this came out at the Education Committee. Now, they predicated kind of things on a 25% reduction, but it was clearly much, much higher than that, a 25% reduction of international students, but it was much, much higher than that. So basically that meant that their forecast of finances dropped quite significantly. The other element as well, and this was the interim finance person, Helen Simpson, who had said this, that effectively there was also the year's finances were predicated on cuts within the university, none of which were made. So there was two factors there that kind of came into play, which basically effectively lay them in a completely vulnerable financial situation. But none of this was mapped out. None of this was looked at. There seemed to be no overview of what cuts were made. There seemed to be no real discussion about what happens because of the currency and the hostile environment with families. The interim chair of the court said that they had been given reassurances. She said that a few times. They had been given reassurances that this was fine. It wasn't, and this is what shocked me to the core. That's what kept me awake at night, actually. Helen Simpson, the interim finance director, came into post on the 8th of November, 4 days before the University Court found out about the financial crisis. She was on her first day in the job. Her first day in the job. She'd barely got her cup in the staff cupboard, and she saw that the university was in financial crisis, and she was in the principal's office at the end of that very first day. What's also important, and this is what she said you couldn't give too much information because the investigation will look into this, but two senior accountants says to her, "You know, don't you?" And she says, "Well, what do you mean?" They says, "You know you know what's happening here. And they said that they had tried to raise it upwards and it had fallen on deaf ears. So there's a whole host of stuff that needs to be unpicked with the investigation there. We, a student actually had kind of hired a lecture hall where we all watched this committee, and we were literally all kind of going, oh, my God, it was staggering to see what had happened. The other more important thing, the other really important thing as well, is that Tricia Vey, the interim chair, had given a sense of the absolute gravity of the financial crisis. When I was in campus a couple of days before, I kept thinking to myself, it feels like the university's in free fall. It feels like we're in free fall. Turns out that feeling was absolutely correct. She said that had the Scottish government not given that 22 million in aid and money and lending, then they would run out of money by the end of June. They would no longer be liquid by the end of June. That was how serious that financial crisis in the university was, and actually still is.
Thank you, Siobhan. It's been reported that auditors had asked questions about allegations of fraud. I think you hinted at that there just now, Siobhan. And unusual transactions 2 months before the crisis was announced. Maggie, I'm wondering, I think you said that you'd been to some of the education committee hearings. Was any of that brought up in allegation of frauds in there?
So when the university principal and other members of University Court and the University Executive Group appeared at the Education Committee a few weeks ago, the interim principal actually said that he could not rule out criminality. So, we still don't know. We still don't know. There is an investigation that, as Siobhan has said, that is ongoing. There's an investigation into what's happened, what has brought the university to this point. And I think there are a couple of things that you mentioned and that Siobhan has spoken about that I want to pick up on. But I think the first thing that I'd like to say is just to put this in the context of funding of higher education across the UK. So, people have said, oh, it's Dundee now, but it'll be other institutions as well. Other institutions are likely to fail financially. And I think that should give us all pause for thought. What is it that we think our universities are there to do? What is it that we think higher education is there for? And if we think, and I think the majority of people do think, that university is a benefit to everybody. Not only are we training teachers and social workers and doctors and dentists and engineers and the people who actually help us live on a day-to-day basis, but we're also teaching and supporting creativity and community and the arts and the things that actually allow us to experience life to the full as human beings. And if we value all of those things, then we should be funding higher education effectively. And in my view, in the view of, I think, many, certainly in the view of the Scottish Greens, is we haven't, across the UK, had adequate funding going into higher education. In England and Wales, so Scotland doesn't have tuition fees for Scottish students, but England and Wales do have tuition fees. And it's quite clear that the key driver of that is not to, not to make students learn better or be better students or anything like that. It's to marketize, to commodify higher education. It's to make universities operate like businesses. And they are not businesses. They should be there for the common good. So that's the broader context. However, that does not explain what's happened at Dundee University. That doesn't explain what's gone wrong at Dundee University. And even with all of those things, we know lots of other institutions are not in this situation. So there have to be specific issues that have happened at Dundee University. One thing, and Siobhan has talked about this already, is this ridiculous over-reliance on international students and the failure of management, and I believe this is a clear failure of management, to not adequately account for the risks associated with that over-reliance on international students who pay exorbitant fees.
So
Sorry.
No, it's okay. We're running out of time a bit, so I was just going to recap. So there may be problems with the Scottish education system, but they're not to blame for what's going on at Dundee University.
No, absolutely not. And I think, we know that Dundee University did not properly account for the risks associated with that overexposure for international students. And the idea that they didn't model for the chilling effect of those immigration rule changes that Siobhan has talked about. They didn't model for those is really just staggering, because any one of us who have had anything to do with the immigration system, who have watched the hostile environment build up over the last few years, any one of us who's watched that happen knows that it's not just the people who are directly affected that will stay away or not come to the UK. It's their families, it's the friends they tell, it's their wider communities. It's that chilling effect that Dundee University has been affected by particularly. However, there is something clearly else going on there, and that's what the investigation is there to find out. We know that there has been serious mismanagement. I don't think there can be any question about that. And the idea that none of this was this wasn't the highest level on their risk register, the top of the risk register. Yeah. When I asked at the Education Committee what number one on the risk register of the university was, it was cybersecurity. It wasn't financial sustainability or international student recruitment or anything. It was cybersecurity. So what's going wrong with the governance of the institution? That's what we need to fix.
Thank you, Maggie. Siobhan, can you maybe tell us something about the people who were responsible for the management of the university leading up to the crisis? So what roles did they play, and what decisions were made? Because I think, isn't it important to note that a lot of the people that we hear mentioned in post now, they're interim posts, aren't they? Because a lot of the people that were there at the time, they've gone. So maybe tell us something about those people.
So, my understanding is that there has been 4 different finance directors in the last 4 to 5 years within the University of Dundee. Helen Simpson is another interim. And she obviously, as I mentioned, she's relatively new to post. What you have in Dundee is what's called the University Executive Group. That comprises of the principal, who is on about 300,000 per year, more than the First Minister. Then you have, I think, 6 vice principals. Wendy Alexander, when she left, she was on something like 200,000. So you have this core group of people that were supposed to oversee what was actually going on. Now, there's also a university court, which is they're basically the actions of the university are answerable to the university court, who basically sit and look over the information, question and approve, etc. Now, what you've actually got is the principal immediately left. He did some monthly sessions, and after the announcement, there was one due a couple of days later. He didn't even bother turning up. So then you had the vice principal who took over. Now, he said at the committee that he didn't know anything about the financial situation because he was the academic side. Now, as vice principal, he basically completely said, no, that wasn't my bag. That wasn't really my area. Obviously that was questioned. So you've got this group of people that didn't seem to know what was going on. But actually, more worryingly as well, and this was brought up, and I think it was Maggie that raised this as well at the committee, there was no one, in terms of the recovery plan and in terms of the strategy, there seemed to be no one else outside that very small group. The unions were definitely not involved. The unions were fighting to get involved for a long time. So there seemed to be no ordinary staff across the university that were involved in that recovery plan as it stands. That's why we ended up with a plan that gave us 632 full-time job losses. And I will just kind of quickly say as well, the B plan was that the university would be broken up and sections of it would be picked up by other institutions. So, as an example, I'm speculating, but St Andrews might pick up science, medicine and life sciences, for instance. The C plan was that the university ceased to exist. That's how serious it was. But what the university executive group did is they closed off the whole process. Those that were actually responsible for not overseeing what happened, they closed off that whole recovery process and did exactly the same as what they had been doing, is being completely blind to everything else was going on and come up with a plan. What actually helped, it was to kind of placate the banks rather than actually have a kind of a fair work, human-based response to the kind of crisis.
Thank you, Siobhan. And just for a wee bit of clarity, you mentioned some plans there. So there were 3 plans, as you said, but the first plan was 700 redundancies. They were full-time employment job losses, or break the university up with the parts absorbed into other institutions, or that the university simply ceases to exist. I'm quite keen to get to the part where the Scottish Government were alerted to what was going on and stepped in quickly. So, Maggie, would you maybe be able to pick up the thread and take it to there?
Yeah. So after the scale of the crisis was revealed last year. So in November, December time, I think there were increasing questions in Parliament. There were questions that we had as MSPs to the Scottish Government about what they were doing. And we knew then, so we knew before Christmas that the Scottish Funding Council were looking at what was going on, but we didn't know exactly what the nature of that was. And just before Christmas, I wrote to the Education Committee and said, you need to look at this. You need to interrogate what is happening at Dundee University. And so at the first week back in January, that was the first time the Education Committee of the Scottish Parliament had a discussion about what was going on at Dundee University. And that was with the Minister for Higher Education and the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills. So there were questions, there were challenges, questions were raised about the point we talked about earlier about that over-reliance on international students. Questions were made about the overall funding model for higher education across the UK, not just in Scotland, but across the UK. And I think everybody on the Education Committee had the sense that, yes, we could change. Well, the UK government could, at the stroke of a pen, change the immigration context. They could change those rules that the Conservative government brought in, and allow international students to come here with family members, with dependents. The Labour government at Westminster has refused to do that. So that's one thing we were all very aware of. What we didn't know were the specific things that were going on at Dundee University. Over the course of January and into February, conversations were definitely had between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council. The Scottish Funding Council was having regular conversations with the university executive group, that small group of managers that Siobhan has described at the university. And then we get the financial plan. So the University and Colleges Union, UCU Union at Dundee University, go on strike. And in their third week of strike, the financial recovery plan is presented. And as Siobhan has said, it has these 3 options. And basically everybody says, well, 2 of those options just aren't feasible. They're breaking the university up into little bits, or it's ceasing to exist altogether. But actually what all the unions came together and said, actually that first option, that plan A, isn't an option either. You cannot lose what would amount to nearly a third of your staff team. So it's the 632 posts. It's the recruitment freeze posts that Siobhan, that takes it up to nearly 900. And of course, there'll be more people involved because not everybody works full time. Those were full-time equivalent posts. So with an institution that employs 3,000 people, can't afford to lose just nearly a third of its workforce. That is not a way to secure the ongoing sustainability of the institution. And the Scottish Government agreed. The Scottish Government was very clear. I remember the last day of the UCU strike, that Friday afternoon, Jenny Gilruth, as Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, met with the university executive group. I'm not sure exactly who she met with, but definitely members of the university executive group. And she told them that that plan was not acceptable. Yeah. So they knew then that the Scottish Government and therefore the Scottish Funding Council did not approve the loss of 632 jobs. And yet we haven't seen from the university management the kind of conversation, the kind of opening the books for transparency, but also opening the doors for conversation. We are still waiting for that invitation. Come, let's have a conversation. Let's all, staff, senior management, university court, trade unions, students, let's all get around the table and talk. That has still not happened. And we need the Scottish Government, we need the Scottish Funding Council, we need the investigation, people, anybody with any sort of link into this. That's what needs to happen. That is what we've been calling for, what the trade unions have been calling for since November. Because we know that, as I said before, it's the staff and students that make the university what it is. They have the creativity, they have the ideas, they have suggestions for how things could change for the future, but they need to be heard. And nobody, the university management isn't listening to them.
Yeah. I'm worried that we've maybe not said enough about the strikes before we move on to the Scottish Government. Siobhan, would you agree, or do you want to move on? Time's a bit tight.
Yeah, I'm just going to say very quickly, and I've been very clear on this before. I felt at the time that maybe going on strike was maybe just a little bit too early, but I proved to be extraordinarily wrong. I think if the UCU had not gone on strike at that point in time, then I think that the university would have probably hidden under the radar, and they would have probably tried to get away with that 632 job cut plan. I think it was in part because the union were out, they were vocal and very, very visible, that it shed a lot more light on the situation than what might not done happen. So it's one of those situations where, if you're, and I've had a lot of kind of colleagues say to me, how do I join the union? So there is a real kind of boot there, there's a real kind of sense there that the union has never been so important. The UCU have come up with their own recovery plan, which of course the University Executive Group refused to look at. So the unions have been absolutely clear that working with us, the staff, the unions, those that actually work with the students, working with the students is the only way that we can sustain long-term recovery. The only people that seem to not realise that is the University Executive Group. They are still refusing to rule out Plan A. They're still refusing to do it. They're still on that process. And we had a union meeting on, I think it was Monday, and then there was another union meeting today about that. And one of the things that I proposed is that we demand that they immediately cease any action for that Plan A. But they still seem to be in this delusional understanding that somehow Plan A is workable. It's not. Everybody's telling them that. It's not. And if you just indulge me for a little bit, Maggie mentioned, this is the kind of the students here. I work in student services. Most of the cuts land in what you would class as professional services. So that's things like estates, the libraries, etc., but also student services, which is things like the health centre, the disability service, student funding, all those kind of areas that basically exist to support the health and well-being of students. Now, we as a matter of emergency, we had actually sent a paper to the Student Funding Council just at the beginning of this week, noting the importance of the student services and the dramatic downside of any cuts being made there. What we did find out, of course, is a very, very female-centred workforce, but the Disability Service has already experienced 20% staff cuts due to the freeze. Counselling is something like 33%, and the health service is something like 39% in cut. Some of those services are already beginning to experience devastation of their services, and that's before any further cuts come in. So student services are particularly vulnerable, and we're working on at the moment on a strategy in order to promote student services and the essential requirement that is needed for student health and well-being, but actually as well how important it is to the long-term strategy and recovery of the university, because getting students here, getting them to retain their studies and keeping them healthy is core, and it will be core to that recovery as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. So the strike, it seems, did alert the Scottish Government, and they were quick to respond to the crisis, with the Finance Secretary Shona Robertson announcing £15 million in additional funding, with another £8 million being provided by the Student Funding Council, on the proviso that this funding could not be used for compulsory redundancies. Did the Scottish Government respond quickly enough, and is the additional funding adequate? Maggie, the Scottish Government responds, is it adequate?
So clearly the financial support that has come through the Scottish Funding Council from the Scottish Government is welcome. You know, as Siobhan mentioned earlier, it's actually crucial to maintain the liquidity of the institution for now, but it doesn't actually solve the crisis. It doesn't solve the problems that have been that are a consequence of bad decision making. So those problems still remain, and you know, here we are in the middle of April. This crisis came to light in November. We should be having the kinds of conversations that we're having now with the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government. We should have been having them before Christmas. So there hasn't appeared to be the urgency, I think, from the Scottish Funding Council, certainly not from the University Executive Group, in terms of how to respond. And it's because of pressure, I think, as Siobhan says, by the trade unions. UCU going on strike, Unite and Unison, preparing to ballot for and balloting for strike action. That has put pressure, and that has focused minds. But, you know, staff have had 5 months of uncertainty. Staff have had to be, you know, thinking, well, will the university exist? Will I still have a job? Will we still have students to teach in the coming months? I don't think that the urgency of the situation has been grasped by, you know, across the board in the way it needs to. And I just say again, you know, thank goodness for the trade unions, because they have been, you know, allowing pressure to be put on by MSPs, because they are contacting us, telling us what's going on as best they can. Telling us what they don't know, because the management hasn't answered their questions. But we shouldn't be here 5 months on, still not knowing, or still having that atrocious 632 job loss recovery plan on the table. That should have been gone long ago. It should never have even seen the light of day, because students and staff should have been around the table from the moment this crisis came to light. That didn't happen, and it still hasn't happened. We need to see that happen.
Thank you, Maggie. So on Monday of this week, the Scottish Government announced that it's appointed Sir Alan Langland to lead an independent task force. That task force will bring together the expertise. That task force will bring together expertise to advise the university, the SFC. It's going to include the university, the SFC, the City of Dundee and the Scottish ministers. In addition, support to University of Dundee is also being provided from a trio of experienced advisors, Sir Anton Muscatelli, Sir Paul Grice and Andrea Nolan. Today it's been announced that international professional services firm BDO will carry out an independent investigation into the university's finances. Siobhan, what are your thoughts on this expert group that's been put together?
Well, the three experts that Muscatelli et al. Are choices from the interim principal. The recovery task force, however, is something that was set up via the Scottish Government and Student Funding Council. It will include trade unions. One of the things that we are working towards quite strongly within the UCU union is that local unions be involved, and as well as local representatives and local students as well, because that is key. As Maggie mentioned earlier on, there's something very specific about what happened at Dundee University, so it does require very localised knowledge, I think, and a localised democracy within that process. And so I kind of worked with one of the co-conveners of the UCU to send a letter to Jenny Gilruth on Monday to say, this is what we would like. We would like local representation from the unions, because that, I think, would be key. So there is an element. This, for me, it was a breath of relief. It allows us some thinking space, and it allows us some time to genuinely come up with a genuinely meaningful and fair package that will keep the university sustainable and not have the level of job losses that the university saw fit to propose. We all know that cannot happen. The thing about Dundee University is it's so, as most universities are, so integrated into the city. So it's about 1 in 10 employed within the city. During term time, students make up 1 in 7 of the population. Its impact on Dundee's economy, its culture, its diversity, its art and creativity is absolutely huge. So if a university goes under, then it has massive ripple effects within Dundee. I think Maggie had mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this feels a bit like, the severity of the Timex when that was occurring in the 80s. So the impact is real, it's severe, and it's genuinely strained at the university. Staff are extraordinarily stressed. Students are picking up on it. As a disability advisor, that's become part of my discussion with students. Are you managing? Are you coping with the strain? Because even if they're not in themselves worried, they're picking up on that strain from staff. You feel it on campus the minute you walk on campus. It is extraordinarily stressful.
Thank you, Siobhan. We're pretty much out of time. Would both of you be able to hang on for a couple of minutes just to discuss one last aspect of this?
Yeah.
You sure? And with my colleagues' permission as well. I hope you're all okay. So I'm just wondering, I suppose, Siobhan, but also obviously you, Maggie, what do you think about how this has been picked up in the media? A lot of the news organisations, they seem to link this to, they say, Dundee University's got in a financial black hole. That's because students don't have to pay for education in Scotland when they do elsewhere. Michael Mara, for example, at FMQs the other day, said, former principal, Professor Ian Gillespie, who resigned last December, and his high spending culture have so much to answer for, but underneath the incompetence is a crisis spreading across our universities as a result of 15 years of SNP failure and mismanagement. And he also said, well, I'm not going to go on. Siobhan, as somebody who works at the university and you're listening to this on the news, what are your thoughts about how you're seeing it covered?
I mean, Maggie never got a chance to kind of answer the last question, so I'm happy for Maggie to go on, and I'll just kind of dip in after.
Again, I'll be led by you two.
Thanks, Siobhan. Yeah, I mean, to address that point first, I think it's tempting. It's easy maybe to make this kind of thing about political point scoring, but this is far too important. As Siobhan said in answer to the previous question, Dundee University is one of the beating hearts of the city. It's vital to the city and therefore to the surrounding area as well. And it's far too important, I think, to make political points like that about. Do I believe that tuition fees are the fact that Scottish students don't pay tuition fees have contributed to this crisis? Absolutely not. We know that there are universities south of the border that are in worse financial difficulty, and there are tuition fees south of the border. This is about as I said, it's about the overall funding model of higher education, of universities across the UK. In Scotland, though, without tuition fees for Scottish students, we have seen really thriving institutions that are able to support students who wouldn't be able to go to university if it weren't for the fact that they don't pay tuition fees. And we can say, oh, well, they're grants and that kind of thing. We know that grants never support, grants and loans never support students the way they should. So if we think education is good for everybody, we should be supporting it and funding it like a universal service. That remains my core belief. This isn't about tuition fees or anything else like that. The Dundee situation, I think, has come from a culture of fear. As Siobhan has said, staff and students are worried, they're scared. It's come from a place of a toxic relationship with transparency. Management has had no interest in transparency, no interest in bringing staff and students into decision making, and no interest in democracy in the institution. We need, in any forward-thinking plan for the university, we need democracy. We need the voices of students and staff to be front and centre. And that's how we will get Dundee out of not only this crisis, but we will lay the foundation for a strong democratic institution for the future.
Thank you, Maggie. And I know that you've been elected rector of Dundee University. I know you don't start until August, but I'm sure that the reason you won that election is because of the stand that you've taken about what's happening in the University of Dundee. But good luck when that does start. Siobhan,
Thank you.
I don't know if you saw FMQs the other day there, but Michael Mara questioned the First Minister about Dundee University, and the First Minister, I can't remember his question, but I do remember that John Swinney's reply was that the plan that's been suggested by Dundee University he feels is unacceptable and thinks it needs a lot more work. But he also made the point that if you've been offered a place at Dundee, you should take it. To go there because it is viable and the like. So I just thought maybe that would hand over to you then and for the last words.
Yeah, thank you. Maggie as rector, it was Maggie or a gladiator, but I think Maggie's the better gladiator, certainly in terms of politics, that's for sure. Yes, I mean, I think that, to return to the fees, I absolutely agree with Maggie, and I think that the attempts to paint it as a fee situation is very, very disingenuous. The attempts to paint it as a kind of an anti-SNP government strategy as well is particularly disingenuous too. And I've completely forgot what you asked me, and I'm so sorry.
It was just whether you agreed with the First Minister that if you've been offered a place at Dundee, then you should take it.
I mean, yes. I mean, this is a very. I mean, it's deeply bad timing, because what you've got as the situation is that students have been given their offers. Of course, applications go in usually about December, but they've been given their offers, and UCAS give them to the end of April to decide whether they want to accept those offers or not. So we're looking at the stats for our office, for instance, a lot of kind of, unconditional, conditional firms, etc., but not many students have kind of accepted those offers yet. Unfortunately, the time frame in which they're having to decide is the middle of a crisis, unfortunately. But one of the things that we were looking at doing in our office, of course, is to do what the university should be doing as well, is writing to students and reassuring them, that our educational establishment is one of the best. To use Scottish University of the Year last year, our student experience is extraordinarily high, our student services are extraordinarily high quality, our research and teaching is extraordinarily high quality as well. I think the task force has helped stabilise that a little bit, because at least there is a sense of a fairer solution and a more sustainable solution will happen. So yes, it's a difficult time, but yes, absolutely, we need to kind of show students that we're still here. The university is not the university executive group. It is the staff that work damn hard within that university under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and the vibrancy of the student cohort. And I hope that we can kind of persuade students that this is still the university to come through. We are cutting edge in our research, we are first class in our teaching and our student experience, and there is so much that a student can get from Dundee University. It's just we need to get over this hurdle and we need to stabilise ourselves.
Thank you, Siobhan. So that's it for this evening. You'll probably be glad to hear. So thank you to our guests, to Maggie Chapman, MSP, and to Siobhan Tolland. It was great to have you. But before we go, I just want to remind you at home that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We were £16,000 short of our funding requirements last year, and that's left us short of the money that we need to pay for our bills this year. We've faced costs of about £4,000 a month, and we get donations of around £2,500, for which we're grateful. We have raised over £8,500 this year so far, but we still urgently need to raise at least another £3,000 if we're going to pay our bills now. Our programmes, you know, will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or please just donate whatever you can afford. Anyway, so that's it for now. Thank you again to our guests, Councillor Siobhan Tolland and Maggie Chapman, MSP. And goodbye. Thank you to you for watching.